Thank you for listening to another episode of Smash the Bug. It's exciting to have you as a part of this episode here today, and we're going to be talking with a special person, Robert Rand from JetRails. He has extensive history with e-commerce in quite a number of different aspects, and we're going to be learning from him, talking about some current news as well as his experience and what he would have to share to us as e-commerce developers and how we can do better with our profession. As always, if you are listening to this, make sure to subscribe. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify. If you're looking for a podcast, you will find Smash the Bug podcast there, as well as on YouTube under the SwiftOtter YouTube channel. Make sure to subscribe for that because I'd hate for you to miss out on future great content just because you happen to forget clicking that subscribe button. So, without further ado, let's jump in and welcome Rand to the stage. Welcome, Rand. It is great to have you as a part of this podcast today.
Always great to get to hang out with some of my friends from the Magento ecosystem.
Yeah. You are quite certified. That's one thing we always like to ask the people. I don't know. I like to ask that question just because I'm big into certifications myself. But like you're a Magento 1, Magento 2, Solution Specialist, Business Practitioner, Adobe Certified Expert, the Certified Scrum Master, and obviously some certified in Google Analytics and Ads and Bing. You got a lot of certifications there.
One day my wife asked me if I was basically the equivalent of a Pokemon trainer and going around gym to gym getting badges.
Nice. I think that's a nice comment.
Well, for me, I love that this industry lets us keep learning and growing, and I always want to bring new skills to the table for myself in order to better understand the challenges of merchants and businesses and everyone else, and in some cases to roll up my sleeves and do things better.
That's terrific.
This old dog still wants to learn some new tricks. Well,
you can't say you're that old, right? You just had a birthday, and you privately disclosed your age to me, and it's not that old.
Well, it's pretty old, but I look good for my age. So
good for you.
That's really what you were trying to go for.
Well, I was going to say, it must be that skincare regimen that you so faithfully do every day. Anyways, it's great to have you on here. You work for JetRails, which is a hosting company, right? Maybe you want to just share real quick about what you do there and what JetRails is.
Sure. So at the heart of it, JetRails is what we like to refer to as a mission-critical web hosting provider. So as opposed to just having raw infrastructure or covering the basics, we wrap around service layers to really cover everything, as they used to say, soup to nuts. Okay. So we're dealing with speed, with security, with reliability and stability and uptime, with flexibility, which is probably the most unique there, and really high-touch support. And we're dealing with a lot of the scalability needs of business-to-consumer brands and such. And so you're getting not just the hardware or some of that, but we're handling load testing. We're dealing with intrusion detection systems and malware scanners and tweaking firewalls and configuring CDNs and dealing with all sorts of things that might not fall into the norm in all situations, because we know that people just want to sleep well at night. Mm-hmm. And we have a NOC, a Network Operations Center, where 24/7 we're monitoring whether it's on our hardware, whether it's at AWS, one of our great partners, or DigitalOcean, or we're there to make sure that people are getting what they need out of their hosting without having their own in-house 24/7 team sitting and watching it, so that the website can really perform. Yes. And the business owners can focus on sales and marketing and merchandising and all the other wonderful things that e-commerce users should be dealing with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally get that. Yes. And you have your own podcast, right? Maybe you want to just...
I do. I host the JetRails podcast. So I've been doing that for over 2 years now. We're 70 some odd episodes in, and that's been a lot of fun. So we really talk a lot about things that matter to e-commerce marketers and merchandisers and store owners and e-commerce managers and all sorts of other folks in the industry. And so that's been just a pleasure. I know that we've had you on as a guest
Yes.
recently, and that was fantastic. Getting to talk.
Yeah, I was going to say congratulations on the consistency. It's always impressive to have 2 years of solid consistency. Well, you said 70-some episodes, so good for you. Good for you in that. I'm curious your take on, let me just say, from the developer's perspective, I think one of the, I might even use the word fear, is the changes in the ecosystem, the e-commerce ecosystem, and specifically, obviously Adobe bought Magento at 2018, $1.5 billion, and they have to pay that money back. So the concern is, well, is open source going to go away? Now with the rebranding of Magento Commerce to Adobe Commerce, like how are these changes going to play out in the industry going forward? What is your thoughts on this? Should we be concerned that is open source going away, or is this like just continued progress in the right direction? What is your thoughts there?
So there are challenges in terms of the community and in terms of what I'll refer to as a divergence. You have those Adobe Commerce users, and that platform continues to, in terms of its future architecture, continues to scale up. It will continue to be a strong competitor against a lot of those other top tier players. Most of them have been acquired, like Demandware and Hybris, now owned by companies like SAP and Salesforce. And
yes,
there's that side of the house, and there are Adobe partners from the Magento ecosystem as we knew it, that will continue to follow that, ride that train. And there's nothing wrong with that. You have an entirely different ecosystem that's reliant on Magento open source, and that includes a wide range of developers and agencies, wide range of merchants, and they're not necessarily aligned with where Adobe Commerce is heading one way or the other.
Yeah.
And then you have those that are straddled in between, folks that are on Adobe Commerce on-prem now, or folks that, agencies that work on both.
Yes.
And if I had to predict, which is a dangerous business in tech, I think that there will continue to be more of a rift between the two platforms. That Adobe Commerce is going, deeper into microservices. Now there's Adobe Live Search, for instance,
yes,
which will be competing with things like Search Spring and all sorts of, Algolia, all sorts of search integration. Yeah, also, there's a lot of great companies. And it's not so much the competition there that's the story, but I think it's, if we continue to see category by category pieces of this go SaaS, become part of, Adobe's SaaS offering, as opposed to just, open source, but hosted in the cloud, which is more of what Magento, had been previously working toward, with some exceptions. But I think that that's where there's more divergence than ever, is, the folks that are ready to invest more heavily into a very custom progressive web app, PWA experience, right, and the folks that would rather get back towards something a little bit cleaner in terms of the amount of maintenance and development needed, more like what they might have experienced for years and years with Magento 1. And we're actually seeing, so the Magento open source community, as I'll refer to it, is focused on solving some of those problems. And we're still seeing lots of extensions come out and themes. I mean, to take a more modern approach to give something that could load faster and better without necessarily needing to go with a custom PWA experience or certain other things that might not be for everyone at this stage in the game.
100%.
And so I think that what we're seeing are some really healthy things happening on the open source side, and some really natural things that everyone has expected since Adobe acquired Magento happening on the Adobe Commerce side. I think that where we get more frustration in the mix, it's the communication. At Adobe Summit, there was a track that looked at the Adobe Commerce roadmap. Same week, there was a similar presentation for the Magento Association members, which free organization. Anyone that's in the Magento community that's not a member should go sign up now. And there was no track about the future of Magento open source and was really focused on the commercialized version. And that lack of communication and that lack of insight, I think, is what leaves people, a little bit more flummoxed, because people want to know that. People want to be part of that discussion. At the same time, about half of code being committed to Magento in general is still coming from the open source community. And there's a lot of great movement. I can say from the hosting side that, we've seen steady growth. But, we also see a lot of interest around, what's going on with Shopware as an open source platform.
It's just going to call that out, yes.
Yeah, I mean, and it's... Mm-hmm. Yes, it's partly because Ben Marks headed over there, and Ben certainly has a very well-deserved following.
Oh yeah,
he's
absolutely.
a great guy, and he's earned the respect that he has in the community. But there's this interest in the community at checking out Shopware and being a part of something there. At least potentially, in some cases, there are already partners signing up and getting involved. People want to have that open source community to participate in.
Yes.
And I think part of the challenge here is that the Magento Association, while it's formed and it's alive and active, I don't think that there's any projection of exactly when it'll hit that point of being able to potentially take over stewardship of Magento open source under their nonprofit framework, the way that our friends at the Drupal Association oversee Drupal as an open source platform. They have some funding coming in from Adobe and from sponsors. And I think in some ways, that a lot of that funding is going towards some of that oversight and management, and that, they need to get to a point where they've got more people that are deeper into the community and dev employed full time to really be able to take on something more in terms of the role. Back to challenges. Part of the challenge is that for Adobe, the way that their current website and some, I should say, a good chunk of their collateral talks about open source, talks about it as a competitor. It talks about it as, you should really be considering Adobe Commerce. Mm-hmm. And, when people see and experience that in that process, that they're not necessarily getting, an even shake at what are the differences between these things?
The thing that keeps coming to my mind, though, in this conversation about open source is how much more iteration at this point is truly necessary, right? It's a platform. The whole idea of an e-commerce platform is it's a starting point that I'd be curious to know the actual numbers that works for, say, 50% of merchants out of the box, or maybe it's more like 30% of merchants out of the box. But really, it's a platform to be extended. And at that point, you want something that's stable. And it doesn't have to have all the features in the world, as long as there is other good community provisions out there for that, good third-party modules. But ultimately, and that's where I think the Whova theme comes in and is really powerful in this, because I think we would all agree that the Magento Luma theme is pretty lousy. I mean, it gets the job done, but from a development perspective, it's lousy. And from what I've seen on Whova, we haven't had opportunity to work with it yet. It looks really powerful, and that seems like what developers need is a good foundation on the front end. And I think ultimately the back end code for Magento open source and commerce, that's good. It's solid. Like it's well built. It's slow. There's a lot of the stack trace is crazy high, but from a developer's experience, it's pretty decent. And obviously, I think Shopware is easier, but I'll be very curious again to see how Whova changes things long term in the market.
And these things will evolve. I mean, Whova is still, relatively young, and so, for instance, it hasn't necessarily been worked with lots of extensions, and so there might be a little bit more dev work around that. Yep. Depending on what you're using. But back to what you said earlier about Magento, what percentage of folks don't have extensions or haven't had to do any customization? I don't think that that's the major Magento market today. Because if they didn't need anything unique, maybe Magento isn't what they needed in the first place.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
So most people that I know on Magento are using a lot of extensions. And well, I mean, as I think of that as a good use. It's a little bit of an interesting position that we're in, given that, these platforms have all been around for years. Shopware isn't new. Magento
Nope.
2 is not new anymore, not by far. 2015, it reached I don't know if we could call that, real general release. It was
That was
maybe
an alpha
alpha,
release.
but
yeah.
that we'll be kind about what happened then. But
Yes.
the story's not over. And the community is still strong and still innovating. And so I'm with you there, that as long as we have a community that's still very active and that's still doing what they're doing, and the fact that, again, people are looking at Shopware, it's because people still have value in open source.
Yes.
And that's a whole conversation onto itself, just, comparing and contrasting. But I think a lot of it comes down to communication and expectations. And so people are used to certain communication coming down through Magento Imagine and through other things. And it's different. And there's almost the expectation that, this is commercialized and you should understand that. And to some extent, it's probably true. So
that's fair. Okay.
I think that's where we're at.
That's good. I definitely appreciate your thoughts on that. So I think this conversation for developers is really good. I think a lot of them are having these thoughts about open source and commerce and like what's really happening here and all that. But if we zoom out a little bit and we think about what impact do us as developers have in this merchant to agency relationship? And ultimately, you could say merchant to freelance, right? Freelance developers. That's much more personal. Because I think it's easy to look at, okay, I had my job, I write code, build modules, fix problems, and I go home at the end of the day. And while I hope that's true, I hope that, companies aren't requiring people to work crazy hours and overtime and all that stuff. I think there's a lot that a developer themselves can do to build those relationships, to give positive impressions from a merchant to an agency, i.e., because ultimately an agency is a collection of developers as well. So what would you say as far as me as a developer that I can do to help boost, grow, build this agency merchant relationships?
I spent a long time in the agency space, and a lot of my experience, it comes back to something I just said, managing expectations and communications. Mm-hmm. That's where these relationships soar and people leave great reviews and they recommend, to everyone else they know, and or where they crash and burn.
Yeah.
And there are cases where there's just a misalignment right from the start and somebody doesn't realize it or understand it. Mm-hmm. I got to a point where some of my sales process was going through a little bit of a risk analysis. These are the things that could go wrong in your project. These are the things that could slow it down or add to the price or, add hours or whatever, or scope change fees. How do I make sure that, how do I spend more time in the estimating process with you to make sure that I understand your needs and that you understand what's included, what's expected, and what's not, so that we don't get to an impasse where you're not getting what you thought that you were going to get. And how do I make sure that all aligns? I've had to fire clients, and I don't say that lightly because that's not a fun position to be in. Yeah. And that can lead to a lot of messiness. But I've also been on the receiving end of that conversation and as an agency, which I don't know an agency that hasn't dealt with that several times in their history, been let go for cause, let's call it. So it does start with that proper spending some time getting all the information right, understanding how this is going to work. So somebody that's used to a freelancer and is used to having direct access to them and so on, when you go to, let's say, a mid-size or large agency, there's an account manager, project manager involved, that the devs are working on multiple projects, and everything's got to be managed in a way that keeps everything humming along.
Yes.
There are different challenges, and there's not necessarily a bad thing. That brings a lot of good accountability and goodness to the process. I've had a client once that would just start showing up. We were still in the design phase on his website, and he would come into the office and he'd sit down right next to the designer. Not part of the process.
Nice.
Not scheduled. Not, designer had other projects to work on as well. There are times when something works or doesn't work for an organization. And so I think that that's important to figure out, to be communicative. And the same way that if something is delayed or there is a problem, being able to communicate how it happened, why it happened, to fairly address, responsibility. And that's for all parties. It's usually somewhere on the communication spectrum that things really go awry where there's no coming back.
Yeah, I get it. Well, and what stood out to me there, the first part, what you said there, was being thorough. And I think it's a tendency for a developer we want to jump into the project, right? We want to get banging out some code. And yet, for even something simple like a Magento 2.3 to Magento 2.4 upgrade, we might think, okay, well, we just make a change in Composer JSON, then we do run Composer update, and then we're pretty good, right? We might not even test it on our local system. But at the end of the day, okay, maybe this involves a change to MSI. Maybe this impacts a point of sale system very negatively. There could be a lot of aspects, and ultimately,
maybe an extension isn't compatible with the new version.
Maybe things that extensions have core hacks in them, and you go swap that extension out. It shouldn't have been installed in app code, but it was installed in app code. You just go drop a new version in. Yeah, exactly. And this very important business critical functionality is gone now.
I've seen this, hit in so many different ways because if you don't understand what the goals are in situations, okay, you want us to install this extension. What are you expecting the user, what are you expecting that experience to be like? And let's walk through that, and let's make sure that we're installing the right thing for the right reason in the first place. Yeah. And at the same time, okay, we're upgrading. Let's look at the extensions you have. Let's see if they're compatible. And do you still need all these? Well, at some point, something that was useful before isn't, and why should you still have it running and heating up stuff? But then you get to the aftermath and the user acceptance testing. I love, JetRails is particularly good at it in terms of migrations and upgrades of the hosting environments and things, but you need to test certain things in a development or staging environment, make sure that everything's good before it gets pushed out to the production, to the live site. Yeah. And often that gets skipped, and that's when there's phone calls on the weekend and, in the middle of the night, and things are not what they should be, and nobody's happy. 'Cause trust me, I've lost a lot of sleep in those situations. That somebody said, yeah, this is good, and it wasn't. I mean, I got to a point where I wouldn't let our dev team push out code on a Friday. We've got Monday to Thursday for that, unless it's it's a security fix or something. We're not doing that on a Friday anymore.
Familiar. That's funny. That's very funny.
Yeah. Yes. Sometimes some of those rushes that we put into things, yes, there's a benefit to getting things done quickly, but taking the time to actually, go through proper quality assurance and all is tremendous.
Oh yeah, for sure, absolutely. And I think that's really good. So, working to make sure that we are thorough, working to that we are covering all of our bases. I love the user acceptance testing. That we understand the project, fully understand the project we're tackling. It's easy, again, from my perspective, to oversimplify it, and it's exactly what you're saying. To truly understand that this project is complex, or maybe it's easy, and that's great if it's easy. But also, on the other hand, communication. Somebody
that signs on for one of these sites, and if they don't understand just how many things have to work together, that you have all these extensions written by different third parties, that you have payments and shipping and taxes and other things hitting different APIs. And look, if UPS is having an issue with their servers, with their APIs, it wouldn't be the first time in the universe, or or Stripe or something. Anything can really happen. That it's not necessarily the agency's fault. Having some kind of tolerance and understanding and game plan for who to contact and how you're going to receive communication at that point, and how it's going to be dealt with. I remember having a client that wouldn't hang up the phone with me while I was trying to deal with a third party that was having an issue with them. And it was getting a little tenuous. Like, I really need to focus on solving this problem for you with the third party that was involved, and having you on hold and it beeping and all this not helping. And they really didn't want to take that for an answer. And at some point, I think that all these relationships, honestly, are a form of partnership. They are relationships.
They are.
And so if you hire someone, you really do have to be prepared to work with them. And if, when there's a divergence, you have to sort out, if you can have a meeting of the minds. And if not, definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I get it. That's good. Robert, listen, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for coming on. And it gives good insight as far as what we as developers can do to look forward to the future. And the additional perspectives are really great. Concerning the Adobe changes to the ecosystem and all that, as well as just learning how we can do better interacting with the merchants and all that. That's kind of, they're the ones who put the food on our table, and you could say we also put food on their table too, right? Because developers are critical to the whole process. But I really appreciate this. This has been fantastic, and thanks for taking the time for coming on.
No, thanks for having me. This was great.
Well, very good. It was a pleasure having Robert here on this show. Hope you learned from this. It was great insight, great advice, and fantastic reminders. We always got to be keeping this stuff at the forefront. I miss this, and it's just that it's easy for me to not be detail oriented. But us as developers, we've got to be detail oriented. That's what Robert was talking about, being detail oriented. So I hope that it's a good reminder for all of us. If nothing else, that right there is a good reminder for me. And I hope it is likewise for you. So again, if you enjoyed this show today, please, you'd make my day. I'm sure it'd make Robert's day as well. Leave us a 5-star review on one of these great podcast platforms. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, a comment is always appreciated, and certainly a like and a subscribe as well. But what kind of content do you find especially inspiring, but more than inspiring, helpful? We want to know what is helpful. How can we take your career to the next level to make it as good as possible, as it possibly can be for you? So thank you for taking the time. Look forward to our next episode that'll be coming out shortly.